So welcome to today's webinar, Building Adaptation Skills and Qualifications, Key Considerations for Upskilling the Workforce of Tomorrow. So this webinar is the third of 7 that comprise the Building Adaptation Skills for a Changing Climate webinar series. And the next slide, please. And this fall series, as it is detailed on this slide, will share experiences on how to build climate change adaptation skills. So my name is Dominique Auger, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. And I'm a policy analyst of Natural Resources Canada in the Climate Change Impact and Adaptation Division. Avant de poursuivre, je tiens à souligner que je suis située dans la ville de Québec, où les territoires traditionnels et de traités de plusieurs Premières Nations se rencontrent, dont le territoire de la nation Huron-Wendat. I also recognize that we are all working in a different place, and therefore you may be working on another Indigenous territory, and I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on that. The webinar today is made possible with funding support from Natural Resources Canada through the Canada Climate Change Adaptation Platform and the Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise Program, better known as BRACE. Next slide, please. So BRACE was a 5-year program funded under the Pan-Canadian Framework that wrapped up in March 2022. It funded about 20 projects across several themes to increase capacity of organization, professionals, community, and businesses to adapt. We'll add the link to the BRACE webpage in the chat, where you can find a list of BRACE projects and some results. So the webinar series features work done on the BRACE, but also other related initiatives. The first 2 webinars focused on building capacity for engineers and for planners. And today you'll hear from speakers who take a broader perspective and look at upskilling the workforce of tomorrow through cross-sectoral training and guided by competency frameworks and micro-credential. So before we go with the presentation, a few technical information. So Claire Sanders from the Climate Risk Institute is your technical support for today. She's available if you run into audio or technical issues. You can click on the chat box, find her name in the drop-down menu of participant, and send her a direct message. Please note that your microphones have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distraction or feedback during the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but that doesn't mean that you have to hold your questions until then. So feel free to type your questions during the presentation in the Q&A box. And you can also add comments in the chat box. Notez que le webinaire d'aujourd'hui est en anglais seulement, mais soyez bien à l'aise de poser des questions en français si vous le souhaitez. Finally, we are recording the webinar today and we'll be sending out a link to everyone who has registered along with a copy of the presentation slide. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our 3 speakers today, Pierre Valois, Robin Cox, and David Porter. So without any further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Pierre Valois. So Pierre is a professor at Laval University and the director of the Québec Observatory of Adaptation to Climate Change. The objective of the observatory is to study and monitor individual and organizational climate change adaptation behaviors, to identify the determinant of the adoption of such behaviors, and to validate the effectiveness of training programs for fostering the adoption of adaptive behavior to climate change. Pierre will present the training program they've been developing over the past 2 years in collaboration with Ouranos, and will highlight key learnings that are transferable to others interested in building adaptation skills. Alors Pierre, je te laisse la parole.
Merci, Dominique. So since 2020, our observatory has worked with Ouranos to develop a training program designed to foster climate change adaptation action by engineering, urban planning, and architecture professionals. So next slide. In today's presentation, I'll be giving you a brief overview of the aim of our project, the training course itself, which consists of 5 modules, and finally the lesson and good practices we learned from the experience, and finally our next step. Next slide, please. So this project is funded by the Ministry of Environment and the Fight Against Climate Change and Natural Resources Canada. We also couldn't have brought this project to life without the collaboration of Quebec engineer, urban planning, and architecture orders. And also the Quebec Infrastructure Society and the other ministry listed in the slide. Next slide, please. So the objective of our project are, first of all, to reinforce engineers, urban planners, and architects' expertise regarding good climate change adaptation practices about the built environment and land planning. However, as behavioral scientists, we are aware that knowledge and skill don't necessarily amount to real behavior change in the workplace. Aizen theory of planned behavior postulates that attitude, perceived social norms, and perceived ability, someone can call that resilience, to change behavior are also necessary. And these three factors are determined by our belief, people beliefs. Therefore, through this training, we also aim to reinforce positive beliefs around climate change adaptation, such that ultimately the professional will develop their expertise regarding climate change adaptation practices, in addition to a strong motivation and intention to implement adaptive practices in their day-to-day work. Next slide, please. To achieve this objective, we took the following step. I'll go quickly on this. First, we conducted a literature review and administered a questionnaire to 400 professionals to assess the belief held by engineers, architects, and urban planners toward climate change adaptation of the built environment, as well as identify gaps in their knowledge and skill in the subject. We also sought to understand what climate adaptation action they were already undertaking in their professional practice. We also conducted an interview with a sample of 44 professionals to determine their training format preference. In the meantime, we developed a competency framework with the adaptation expert to elucidate what skill, knowledge, and tools constitute a strong background in climate change adaptation of the built environment. Based on this framework and the result of our needs analysis, we developed a pedagogical curriculum, which consists of the concrete learning objective of the training course. The learning objectives then form the backbone of the raw training material. We then transmitted our raw training material to a team of technopedagogues who used them to elaborate a storyboard. We validated the storyboard with our partner, the professional orders and ministry, and implemented their suggestion and correction. Finally, the technopedagogues developed the storyboard into learning capsule using the software Articulate. The learning capsule for each training modular were further validated by a sample of approximately 20 professionals before being released. Next slide, please. The training program consists of 5 modules. Following a recommendation by the 3 orders, the modules are optional. Candidate of the training program can choose to either follow the whole training program or select individual modules based on their interests and prior knowledge. As you can see, the first module addresses the climate crisis in general, including the global and Canadian state of affairs. It then describes the implication of climate change for the built environment and profession related to it. In the second module, we address how climate data can help professionals develop adaptation strategies. We showed them how climate information is collected, where to find it, and how to interpret and integrate it into decision-making. Next slide, please. In the third module, consists of developing the professional theoretical understanding of climate change adaptation. We expose the participants to the main adaptation concept, like risk, vulnerabilities, exposition, and challenges related to climate change adaptation. For instance, maladaptation. The fourth module relates to the climate change adaptation pathway, which consists of 4 steps: recognizing the issue, getting ready to perform adaptation action, implementation of the strategies, and adjusting the strategies. Next slide, please. The last modules addresses the institutional tools professionals can mobilize to integrate climate change adaptation action in their practice. I have to say that the training will be accredited by the 3 professional orders. Next slide, please. The engineers, just check my times. Okay. The engineers, urban planners, and architects have the same core learning objective in the course, but since their professional practices differ, we developed specific content to cater for each profession. For instance, in the first modules, we asked what climate change related challenges and opportunities professionals can expect to encounter in their careers. Candidates can then choose to view videos or interview with adaptation experts from each profession answering this crucial question. This way, professionals can access information catering to their area of work, as well as understand the perspective of the other professional, which is essential as adaptation of the built environment is an integrative process requiring the cooperation of all professionals involved. Next slide, please. Okay, now it's the slide concerns the good practices. Here, so are a few of the good practices we learned from the experience of developing these scores. First, it was a good idea to sign an agreement with the 3 professional orders. We established a great working relationship with them that was invaluable to us throughout the project. Second good practice, regular consultation with partners to validate and re-examine course content is essential at my point of view. By consulting the professional orders, we made sure that the training contents met the professional needs. By consulting climate adaptation experts, we made sure that the presented case studies are realistic and useful. And by consulting the ministries such as the Ministry of Public Security, we made sure that our contents fit this ministry climate change adaptation, I would say, policies and orientation. Third, having our modules tested by around 20 professionals has allowed us to improve and adjust the learning content based on their feedback. Finally, we save a lot of time, money, and energy by asking the order of engineers to host our training program on Maestro, their learning platform. Next slide, please. We also encountered challenges that taught us some important lessons. First, the team of technopedagogues had a limited understanding of the subject matter, and thus the case study and course content sometimes did not reflect the learning objective we had set out. We had to work more closely with them and monitor the content development much more closely than expected. Second, we had a lot of content to go through in the span of 15 hours. Competency development was particularly difficult, not to say impossible, to achieve in such a limited time. Third, constant changes in scientific consensuses means that we will have to update and modify our content even more than we initially expected to. Finally, it was a good idea to collect data about training needs from both climate adaptation experts as well regular professionals. This gave us a more accurate picture of the professional knowledge gaps and needs. Next slide, please. Once our training is launched, we intend to evaluate its success and transmitting the intended knowledge, skill, belief, and behavior to the professional. We will do this by conducting an ad-hoc and post-hoc questionnaire with professionals of our training course and other people who did not follow the training course. By comparing the result between the control and experimental group, we will be able to see if changes are causally related to the completion of our training course or not. Next slide, and I think it's the last one. Yeah. The pre-tests will start as soon as we launch our training program. We will ask each participant to answer a few questions regarding their knowledge, skill, and beliefs surrounding climate adaptation. As well as we will also assess if they are already engaging in certain climate adaptation actions. 6 months after the test, they will be recontacted and asked to complete the same questionnaire once again. We will compare the results with the pre-test to assess any changes. If the training does not achieve its goal, we will be able to act and propose other strategies based on our findings. We believe this kind of critical assessment of our course is essential in providing the best training possible and making climate adaptation a part of everyday decision-making for engineers, architects, and urban planners. I think I respect my time, Dominique. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Pierre. Oui, en effet, tu as bien respecté ton temps. Donc, merci beaucoup. Thank you, Pierre. So at this point, I'm just looking if there's any clarification questions in the Q&A box. And again, we'll open up Q&As more broadly after the three presentations. But seeing none, I would now like to introduce our second presentation, which will be divided in 2 sections. So the first part will focus on the use of competency frameworks and competencies to guide upskilling and the building of micro-credentials for climate action. It will be presented by Dr. Robin Cox. So Robin and her Resilience by Design Lab team are cultivating climate action leadership through applied and arts-based research, design thinking, and innovative curriculum design and education. The goal of our research program is to enable and optimize the capacity of working professionals, youth, and communities to design and implement innovative, collaborative, evidence-informed initiatives and contribute to climate resilience, disaster risk reduction, and empowerment. So the second part of the presentation will focus on a micro-pathway approach to provide knowledge and skill building for climate action. And this part will be presented by Dr. David Porter. So David is a long-time advocate for adapting new technology to deliver educational opportunities and had been involved in online, open, and distance learning since the 1990s. Previously, he was the CEO of eCampus Ontario, leading initiatives to innovate in the online learning space and explore new ideas to provide pathways to learning and skills training. He has worked as an associate vice president, educational support and innovation at the BC Institute of Technology, dean of innovative learning at Humboldt College, and most recently as a senior higher education advisor at the Commonwealth of Learning in Burnaby. So we'll start with Robin. So over to you, Robin.
Thanks so much, Dominique. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you today from the unceded lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples here in what I know as Victoria, and very thrilled to be able to join you today from this beautiful part of the world. So this work that we're describing, David and I today, comes from the Adaptation Learning Network project, which was funded by BRACE funding. It was a capacity building project that really focused on two primary outputs. One was the Climate Adaptation Competency Framework, so evidence-informed framework for competencies, and courses for working professionals across sectors. So unlike Pierre's project, we tried to go broad and design courses that would address the needs of multiple different professionals. We also had a strong network of professionals that were part of the project. So next slide, please. And we'll just skip past that. We'll go on to this one, which is really the focus of this work. We developed courses, and we knew that in developing individual courses that we wanted to work towards having micro-credentials. We know that there's a need for upskilling across sectors, whether it's with accountants or engineers or planners or biologists, foresters, etc. And we know that that training needs to happen now. I mean, really, we're in the midst of it, and we need, what some are calling fast upskilling or fast courses. So because of the urgency of the need to have widespread skills and competencies related to climate action. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? There's a lot of literature right now, and it's growing all the time with reports on the need to provide professionals with training and the desire from professionals to have training that is short, very focused, and accessible. Micro-credentials are not the only way to do that, but they have been proposed as a strategy for doing that kind of short development work with competencies. As Pierre mentioned, there are some challenges with the shortness of it, but nonetheless, this idea that professionals want to integrate new skills into their existing competencies, and they want to be able to do that relatively quickly. They don't want to necessarily do a full degree or a diploma or even a certificate. And this is happening worldwide. Next slide, please. So, the term micro-credential has become very popular these days, and everyone is using it. And what does it mean? And it means varying things to various institutions that are creating them and for people that are taking them. So we've drawn on this definition offered by the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, that a micro-credential is a representation of learning awarded for completion of a short program focused on a discrete set of competencies. So very competency focused, very focused itself, and short. And it's sometimes related to other credentials. So for example, some of the micro-credentials that we've been creating at Royal Roads University will ladder into other longer programs if people want to do that, ladder into diplomas and graduate certificates and graduate programs like the Master of Arts in Climate Action Leadership at Royal Roads. Next slide, please. So some of the key or defining features of micro-credentials, and again, these vary across the country and across institutions, but there's this focus on the narrowness of scope, this idea that micro-credentials, rather than trying to address a broad range of competencies, such as you might get in a graduate program, a master's program or a doctoral program, will focus on a discrete set of competencies, a small number of competencies. And again, this completion time. So we'll talk a bit more about the completion time of ours, but as with Pierre, as he described, these are short bursts of learning rather than long extended periods of learning as you would get in a traditional credential. Next slide, please. The competency-driven nature of micro-credentials is really important. Employers want people to be able to say that they have not only the knowledge, but the knowledge and the skills and the right attributes to be able to claim a competency. And so a part of the work that we did in the Adaptation Learning Network project was to design a climate adaptation competency framework. We did a lot of research, desktop research, and more than 27 interviews with professionals here in Canada, the United States, and in Europe to really understand what those competencies, what the core competencies of someone working the adaptation space might be, recognizing that there is this broad swath of professionals working across climate adaptation. And so a lot of the competencies that we were focusing on are competencies that need to be either added in or perhaps amplified in the existing set of competencies of a working professional. The courses are designed with learning outcomes, and those learning outcomes specifically relate to specific competencies in each course. If you go to the course website, you'll see we've also sort of badged them with icons so that you can see which competencies from the framework are being focused on within a course. And it's all about workforce preparedness, workforce readiness to take action across multiple things. Now we'll talk a bit more about where we're going with the current competency framework, from adaptation to climate action. But within all of this, it's very much a focus on applied knowledge and skills. Applied knowledge and skills, whether that's around net zero financing or urban planning or engineering, resilient infrastructure, public policy, etc. Next slide, please. The V1, the competency framework, the Climate Adaptation Competency Framework, was designed during the Adaptation Learning Network project. It was designed with 5 domains or categories of competencies, and within each of those domains, 4 to 5 specific competencies for a total of 24 competencies. The framework is Creative Commons licensed, so it's an open framework. People can see it, use it, draw from it, change it if they wish. And the idea with this was to really say, what do we need to be doing to advance broadly the skills to mainstream climate adaptation into the workforce, and to do it in a competency-driven fashion. Next slide. This slide is a little out of date, but I want to sort of walk you through it and then sort of walk through some of the changes. We created an initial micro-credential, and we prototyped it this past summer with a very small cohort from Royal Roads, just wanting to get a sense of how it worked. In part, we did a cohort model, which is everyone doing this in concert with each other because of the funding and also because of the timing. Now, the pathway moving forward will not be cohort based. It will allow for a lot of flexibility for people to be able to do this at their own pace, but nonetheless, the rules of the micro-credential remain, which is there are some required courses. We've reduced it from 3 to 2, and the 2 required courses are the Climate Change Adaptation Fundamentals, so really giving you a foundation in climate science and a foundation in just, what is adaptation, what is mitigation, how do those relate to each other, and how do those relate to various scenarios in the climate change landscape. The second required course is Indigenous Knowledges and Perspectives on Climate. And this is a course that is facilitated by an Indigenous instructor. It was also designed by Indigenous subject matter experts. And it really focuses on understanding how to work in the context of Indigenous communities, getting a better sense of their perspectives on the climate and the environment and their own ways of approaching it. Like all these courses, these are short. They're all 4 weeks long. Each week takes about 4 to 5 hours, depending on how much you do of the readings. There's always additional readings and activities. But in total, each of the courses is 4 weeks long, approximately 20 to 25 hours, including an assessment component. And the assessment component is important because it's really about saying, where are you at, and do you have the competencies? Can you apply this knowledge from the course to a scenario? So those are the two required courses. The elective courses, and you take 2 of those, so you 2 required and 2 electives. Range. We started off with some of the ones you see here: natural asset management, financial impacts, and introduction to climate policy, but we're also creating future pathways around climate communication, some more advanced courses in the natural asset management or nature-based solutions stream, some more advanced courses in climate adaptation leadership, and in the finance. So we're going to continue to grow these courses at Royal Roads so that there's some options for people across the micro-credential suite of courses. Next slide, please. We tested the existing competency framework that informs that micro-credential strategy with an environmental firm, and we're also testing it with some students in the MA in Climate Action Leadership, just to get a sense of how it might be helpful to organizations to assess their own capabilities and capacity around climate, and to begin to identify where they need to start growing new skills, new competencies through training or hiring. The idea with this would be that an organization or an entity, a team, can kind of assess where they're at and then assess where they need to go in terms of learning more in specific areas with specific competencies. Next slide. To that end, we are now restructuring the climate action or the climate adaptation competency framework to become a climate action competency framework. Part of that restructuring is to reorganize the framework so that it's more easily applied by organizations or individuals. And that will be aligned with the eCampus Ontario Open Competency Toolkit and Toolkit Guidelines, so that it's really an open competency framework that can be used by anyone to inform either learning or do organizational capability assessments. That work is ongoing. Next slide. In addition to that work, we're also, as I said, bringing in mitigation competencies. So we're in the process of doing some desktop research with that. We'll do another round of interviews so that, again, we have a suite of competencies for the finished version 2 of this framework that addresses both adaptation and mitigation, recognizing that those are increasingly informing each other and need to be thought of at the same time with co-benefits where that's possible. So the V2 will have both of those as a climate action framework. And with that, I will turn it over. I mean, if there are questions for clarification, I can answer those, but otherwise I'll turn it over to David to continue on with his portion of the presentation around the work that we're doing.
Thanks, Robin. I don't see any questions for now, so please, we can go ahead. And for everyone, just a quick reminder that, yeah, you can add your Q&As, your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to answer these questions. So up to you, David.
Thanks very much. I'm going to complement Robin's presentation and Pierre's in a way that will give you a sense of how we might undertake a rapid upskilling for climate action and the kinds of pathways we need to consider to make that happen. Claire, next slide. The critical thing to understand is that we're not talking about an old school approach. We're talking about a rapid, narrow scope, relevant, assessed, accredited approach to pathways that can be digitally verified. Employers are increasingly looking for people with these skills, and they want to know that these skills have been assessed, that they actually meet some kind of defined standard that works and that can be relevant in their workplace. Next slide. There are 3 potential micro-credential pathway models, and I'm going to talk about each of them very, very briefly, starting with the micro pathway. Claire. So micro pathways are things that are under the control of an individual, an employee, someone seeking employment. And it's really about self-directed role-based pathways for employment-related tasks. It also works for people who are in current employment, mid-career professionals that realize that they have skill gaps and they need to close those skill gaps to better meet job requirements. And that's one of the things that we tested with an environmental consulting firm in Vancouver to see if they could self-identify where the gaps in their knowledge and skills were and how we might mitigate those gaps. And one of the things that people are looking for are rapid pathways. Claire. Human resource firms, and I work closely with one in Vancouver, are developing systems that actually work in this context, where people understand that there are competency models that relate to skill profiles in the workplace, and that those in turn relate to jobs, the roles people have within those jobs, the behaviors and skills they require to be effective in those roles. And one of the things that companies are looking for are ways of rapidly giving people skills that meet particular changing roles in the workplace. And so to do that, they need to know what learning resources are available, how those map to competency models, and how those might be recognized by credentials, certificates, micro-credentials, or other ways of demonstrating competence that can actually be verified. Next slide. In the private sector right now, many private sector organizations, and this is Coursera as a good example, which aggregates courses from leading universities and colleges globally, have already developed 195 short courses on the theme of climate and climate action. And you can get a sense just from the 6 illustrated here: ESG for climate change, materiality of ESG factors, climate change mitigation in the developing world, politics and economics of international energy. All of these kinds of courses are available for short-term learning, and sometimes take from 1 month to 3 months to be fulfilled. And it gives people the opportunity to self-direct, choose the learning they need, and map it to their own particular jobs. If your company has a human resource system like the one I just illustrated conceptually, then you can map your learning into that. Next slide, please. Universities are also working in this area, and here's an example of the Climate Change and Infrastructure Risk Management Assessment, the PIVC protocol, that Royal Roads University is now offering online as part of a micro-credential format with our colleagues at the Climate Risk Institute. There is going to be more and more of this as we move forward, and we need to pay attention to how not only how these courses are awarded, how they're assessed, how they're mapped to competency frameworks, and how they fit into sort of national standards and specifications. And I'll come to that a little later. Next slide, please, Claire. The next pathway approach is the meso pathway, the ones that are really organized by institutions and organizations. And these ones are really optimized for university or college, schools, or departments. They can be implemented at a program level. They can have horizontal and vertical pathways, sort of broad knowledge or deep vertical knowledge. And they provide opportunities for laddering into our other larger credentials. And that's one of the strategies that Robin was talking about at Royal Roads. The other interesting thing about these kinds of pathways is when they're mapped to a competency framework, you can also ask incoming students what they already know and validate and give them credit for that knowledge and skills so that they advance on the pathway more quickly than having to take the whole program again. Next slide, Claire. And that's one of the benefits of the Climate Adaptation Competency Framework. We can actually map it to learning outcomes, and from there to courses, and from there to understanding how these courses fit together and assemble into blocks of knowledge and skill. Next slide. And this is a more up-to-date diagram of the concept that Robin was explaining earlier about the micro-credential pathways at Royal Roads University, where there are 2 required courses: Climate Change Adaptation Fundamentals, Indigenous Knowledges and Perspectives, and then specialist courses where you can choose any 2 to broaden your knowledge on a kind of horizontal pathway. But if you want to take it a step further, then the next level are the pathways that are the vertical pathways, the deep knowledge in particular areas of practice, nature-based solutions, communications, policy, leadership, finance. These are the ones that are under development and give you the opportunity to have both horizontal, broad knowledge or deep vertical knowledge, all in a framework that can be executed quickly and is assessed and gives you a sense of not only knowledge, but also skill. Next slide, please. The other potential here is to ladder up into other programs that are like master's programs and others that have more weighty credentials associated with them. And that is one of the things we're also experimenting with at Royal Roads, using the micro-credential as a precursor and advanced credit to moving into the Masters of Climate Action Leadership, McCall, at Royal Roads. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really important in this area of practice is the use of a digital credentialing system such as MyCreds that many universities and colleges in Canada have invested in. These systems produce what are called critical information summaries, digital metadata that can provide the enhanced verification that you need to go with the skill, that you learned it from an accredited institution, it was assessed, it had weight associated with it from the perspective of credit, and that it has a lifespan. It might only be good for 2 or 3 years before it needs to be upgraded. These are the kinds of things that employers are looking for to validate and authenticate knowledge and skills that have been learned in online micro-credential programs. Next slide. And what happens after that is something that currently is missing in the Canadian scene, but exists in other parts of the planet. And those are micro pathways, the things that work for a whole country, that align micro-credential frameworks across provinces, that build national frameworks, and that align with national skills frameworks. Next slide, please. Our colleagues in Australia and New Zealand are very good at this. They have a national micro-credential framework in both Australia and New Zealand, and a national qualifications framework in New Zealand, where the government sets expectations, specifications, and requirements for particular credentials, and institutions and training providers apply to list their credentials for approval, which produces the opportunity for the recognition of skills to be verifiable at a national level. Now, this works in some professions right now in Canada, but it doesn't work more generally across our education and training sectors. And that seems like a gap we need to close. Next slide, please. And so how might Canada address climate action upskilling on a national level? Well, we might ask the question, what capabilities might constitute the essential components of a national climate action competency framework? And what programs and resources exist that might already map into such a framework? And what governance structure would we need to provide that inclusive approach for a national partnership that would allow us to then point to climate adaptation, climate mitigation, climate action as a skill-based framework that is recognized on a national basis by different kinds of professions and that is clear and crisp for all to see. Next slide, please. We're working on this in 2 different ways. With our colleagues at the Climate Risk Institute, we've begun to build out a website called CanAdapt, which is a place to begin to bring together some of these courses, skills, and frameworks that people can begin to examine and explore and see how they can build into profitable and bigger entities that provide the kind of climate action training that the country needs. So that's one way forward, is to engage with partners to explore networked approaches to training, development, and knowledge sharing. Next slide. And the other is to conduct pan-Canadian research to inform a national requirement to upskill for climate action. And we're working with the Academy for Sustainable Innovation in a project they've recently had funded by the Future Skills Center that will be announced later in October, that is looking at how we might build a network national learning ecosystem that provides the opportunity for rapid upskilling against recognized certification that aligns with a national framework. We need to research how to best do this and then begin to implement it in ways that work across the country for training providers, institutions, professional associations. Final slide. And the call to action would be, how do we address a national need for climate action upskilling programs? Well, last week, Ireland announced SkillNet Ireland is going to launch the first micro-credential for climate action for the country of Ireland. That's the kind of position we need to find ourselves in Canada. Have a national qualifications framework, have a national skills framework, have a national climate action skills framework, and begin to align the programs and resources of our training providers and institutions to address that need. Thanks very much. I think I'm 13 minutes right on the button.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Robin. Thank you all actually for the very informative and interesting presentation. We now, and for respecting your time, that means that we have now 13 minutes left for Q&As. So again, folks, if you have any questions or comments, now it's time to add them in the Q&A box. We already have a few. And if we're not able to get to all of them today, we'll follow up after by email. So let me go back to the questions. There's a question, one question specifically to the competency framework for Robin. So I'll start with this one. How did you make sure that the competency framework version 2 is more action-oriented than the competency framework version 1? For example, is the content different? Does it use case studies, or is it using different questions in the final assessment?
Okay, there's a couple of questions in there I'll try and answer. First of all, the competency framework itself is looking at competency. So in one sense, it's not action oriented in the way that you're describing with case studies. But what we will be doing with version 2 is adding in mitigation, this idea that climate action is both on the adaptation side and the mitigation side. So bringing those two together in one framework. So that's really the goal, the primary goal of version 2. The second goal of version 2 is, and this may relate to action, which is to actually make it more usable. I mean, David was talking about role specific and different pathways. And so really to try and frame out, make the framework include, because it's broad, it's not specific to engineers or planners or biologists, whatever, that it will have pathways built into the framework so that people can start to see, okay, I'm a planner, and this is how I need to look at the competency framework. Here are all the competencies. It's going to be the rare person that has, a high or even a medium level of competency in every single competency area, but be able to frame what their needs are based on their role or the tasks that they're trying to do. Once it's applied into courses, the assessments, yes, the content of the courses will be broadened to include mitigation focus. And the assessments as they're currently framed are, because the courses are not for credit, they're not graded. And it's an application of the knowledge to a specific case study. So demonstrating that you can apply the knowledge to a case study. I hope that answers your question, but if not, you can always reach out and ask it again. Thanks.
Thanks, Robin. I'll move to the specific question for Pierre. Actually, there's two, Pierre, maybe that you can answer at the same time. You mentioned negative perceptions of adaptation as a barrier to address at the beginning of the training. What kinds of negative perceptions have you come across, and how did you deal with them? And the other question, are the training modules developed accessible online to professionals and other practitioners post-training? So maybe to clarify how it will be accessible online.
Yeah, okay. It will be accessible on January, maybe February. I hope so. And it will be accessible to any professional, not only engineer, architect, or urban planner. So no, don't worry, it will be accessible to any type of professional. So the other question is, just read it. What is it? Can you remember?
Yeah, it was about the negative perceptions. So what kind of negative perceptions have you come across and how did you deal with them? Negative perception of adaptation.
From who? From whom? From people in from
Well,
professional or
yeah, I would say probably from the questionnaires that you administered at the beginning of your project, if you got any comments on the negative perception and how it can be a barrier.
but not really negative perception, because we could construct the training with experts and the 3 orders. So it was, well, so they gave us feedback all along the process of developing the training. So not really a negative perception, but we have to decide which part will be the main concept. So it's a general knowledge in the first module. So after that, we have to develop specific competency. So it was difficult to in the same modules to develop both parts, a specific one and a common part to all professional. So I think it was a negative perception from us, because it was difficult to develop this kind of training containing a specific general training for the three type of professional, and specific to each type of professional. Not easy to develop.
Okay, thanks, Pierre. And I see that we have a participant from the state mentioning that loving what is going on here, and wonder if David, Robin, and others are partnering with organizations here in the US, and or know if there are similar efforts underway in the States. So maybe Robin.
Yeah, we haven't formally partnered with any groups in the United States. So certainly during the Adaptation Learning Network project, and on an ongoing basis, we're in conversation with quite a number of folks working down in the United States with similar goals. So the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, for example, have their own sort of shorter competency framework and are very invested in upskilling for climate adaptation specifically. And so we've had lots of conversations with them. We've shared our framework with them and vice versa. We didn't work directly with them on these micro-credentials, in part because of the timing, but also because micro-credentials and the design of micro-credentials, as David was saying, can be very specific to a jurisdiction. And because of the difference in content focus somewhat across the Canadian and American jurisdictions around adaptation. Of course, some of it's common to both, but some of the specific case studies and legislation and policies, et cetera, are quite different. So we haven't, it doesn't mean that we wouldn't love to. So if you're thinking of a specific organization, or you're belonging to one, you want to reach out to us, we're certainly open to that. The goal of all the work that we do, and that's why we Creative Commons license it, is to share it as broadly as possible, and share it in such a way that people can, don't have to reinvent the wheel, but can use it if it's useful. And we hope to be able to do that with others as well.
Great, thanks. Anything to add, David? Or
your mic's off, David.
Yep, I think that's Robin's answer is a good one. I think the other that came up in a question had to do with different legislative frameworks that exist in provinces across Canada. And that's really the substance of the research that we're undertaking with the Academy for Sustainable Innovation through the Future Skills research that we are just about to undertake. I think one of the feelings we have is that perhaps climate is an area where there'd be less turf to be fought over than, say, history or economics or geography or something of that in the academic sense, that it is a pressing need for which pressing solutions need to be undertaken. And so if a competency framework or a skill recognition framework in the climate space could be established, it might be a model of practice that others could follow.
Thanks. We did get, we might not get to all questions. We did get, though, questions from the registration form. So resilience continues to be used synonymously, with climate adaptation. However, they have notable differences, specifically in the context of climate change. Can each speaker expand on their understanding of these distinct terms and the implementation of climate adaptation measures under their authority and how it relates to skills and qualifications? Who would like to go first? Resilience, adaptation, Robin?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot packed in. There's like about 5 questions there, but I mean, these terms, as you pointed out, are used differently. And certainly the term resilience has been co-opted so much now that it's used for hair products and climate and everything else. So I think in all cases, anytime we use a term in a setting that's not just a casual conversation, we need to define what we mean by resilience. So climate resilience as opposed to personal resilience, collective resilience, social resilience, etc. Coming from a disaster risk reduction and disaster management background, my evolution of understanding resilience has resulted in something that's probably closer to adaptation, which is around this ability to anticipate events, so that future thinking piece, prepare for and stay as functional as possible during an event, for example, a disaster, and then recover in ways that integrate, in the case of climate, that integrate this future thinking. So it's no longer sufficient to sort of say, it's not a steady state. Resilience is a process. Resilience is an undertaking that will grow and change and morph depending on conditions, etc. So in that way, it is quite similar to adaptation, which is this idea that one has to be flexible, adaptive, anticipatory, and also, and I don't know what the word is, the verb is for it, but be able to look back and learn and then adjust course, right? And that would be my understanding of climate resilience as well as adaptation.
Great, thanks, Robin. Pierre, David, anything to add on adaptation and resilience? Yes, go ahead.
According to the theoretical model that I use, there is a fundamental difference between the construct of resilience and adaptation. Climate adaptation is the process of performing action to reduce vulnerability to climate change. On the other hand, resilience for me is the precursor to climate adaptation. It is defined as the capacity of a person, a system, an infrastructure, an organization to cope with climate change. That is the capacity to cope with the impacts of climate change in the long term, the capacity to mobilize action and resources to adapt to climate change. So the aim of the training course that we have developed is to develop professional resilience, which itself will favor the adoption of adaptive practice. So it's like resilience, it's like perceived behavioral control. You think that you can't adapt to perform the climate action. So we have to develop that, change beliefs of people to favor the adoption of climate adaptation behavior.
Anything to add quickly, David? No? Okay, I see it's already 1:59. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, including, of course, the 3 presenters. As I said, we haven't had time to answer all the questions, but we'll ask our panelists to answer them after, and we'll follow up by email. We also included a few references on the 2 last slides, and we would appreciate, next slide, please, if you could take a minute to fill the evaluation form. The link will be added to the chat. So of course, we welcome any comments to help us improve the upcoming webinars. There's 4 more to come within the series, so your comments are welcome. And the next webinar in the series will be focusing on Indigenous communities. It still needs to be scheduled, but it should take place at the end of October. So information will be shared as soon as possible. And on that, thanks again to the 3 presenters. Thanks for all for participating. It's 2 o'clock, so I'll say thank you all. Merci à vous tous, and hoping to see you for our next webinar. Have a nice day.